The morning sun painted long shadows across the eastern fields as I walked the fence line, just as I had done every morning for the past 20 years. Birdsong filled the air, and the rich scent of earth rose to meet me with each step. This land was more than just acreage to me. It was the beating heart of my existence, the foundation of everything I had ever known. My grandfather purchased these 70 acres back in 1952, when the surrounding countryside was nothing but farmland as far as the eye could see. He built the farmhouse with his own two hands, board by board, nail by nail. My father expanded the operation in the 70s, adding livestock to our crop rotation and constructing the large red barn that still stands as a landmark visible from the county road. I took over operations when Dad's knees gave out 15 years ago. Every furrow, every fence post, every structure on this property had been touched by 3 generations of my family. The calluses on my hands were earned working this soil, coaxing life from the earth season after season. My daily routine was dictated by the rhythm of the land up before dawn to tend to the animals, days spent in the fields, evenings repairing equipment in the workshop. The changes beyond our property line had been gradual at first. About 5 miles east, the suburbs of Lakeside Estates began creeping closer year by year. I barely paid attention to the construction. It was another world, far removed from my agricultural concerns. Occasionally I would notice new rooftops on the horizon, but they remained distant, unobtrusive, irrelevant to my daily existence. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in early April, certified mail requiring my signature. The envelope was thick, expensive paper with an embossed logo I did not recognize. Inside was a stack of documents on letterhead reading, Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. I skimmed the cover letter with growing confusion. According to these papers, my property was subject to their governance. They claimed jurisdiction over my land and demanded compliance with their community standards. I laughed out loud in my kitchen. Clearly this was some kind of mistake. How could my ranch, which had existed for decades before their development was even conceived, possibly fall under the authority of a suburban homeowners association? I tossed the letter aside and went back to work. The spring planting would not wait for bureaucratic nonsense. 3 days later, a black Lexus SUV pulled into my driveway. 2 men and a woman emerged, all dressed in business attire that looked painfully out of place against the backdrop of my working farm. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Lakeside Estates HOA board. "Mr. Davidson," the woman said. Her name was Margaret Whitfield, the board president. "We sent you documentation regarding your property status. I see you have not responded." I crossed my arms. Because it is ridiculous. This is a working farm. It has been here long before your development. The taller man, who introduced himself as Victor Coleman, their legal counsel, opened a leather portfolio. "According to county records, your property falls within the expanded boundaries of Lakeside Estates as recorded in 2018. He produced a map showing property lines, zoning designations, and highlighted areas. According to their documents, my entire ranch now fell within their jurisdiction due to a boundary reassessment I had never been informed about. "This is impossible," I said. "No one notified me of any boundary changes." "Public notices were posted in accordance with county regulations," Margaret replied with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Your property is now subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." Victor added, "We will need to conduct a full inspection to document current violations. Based on our preliminary assessment, there appear to be numerous infractions." I stared at them, my mind struggling to process the implications. What they were suggesting was absurd, and yet they presented their case with such confidence, such casual authority. I ordered them off my property, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, I pulled out the letter again and read it more carefully. The legal language was complex, filled with references to county codes and regulations I had never needed to understand. For the first time, I felt a creeping sense of unease. What if this was not a mistake? What if some legal loophole really did place my farm under their control? The thought kept me awake long after I should have been sleeping, my mind racing with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. The following week, I drove to the county record's office. The clerk behind the counter looked bored as I explained my situation, but she dutifully pulled the relevant files. What I discovered sent a chill through my body. The suburban development that had seemed so distant had been systematically expanding its boundaries through a series of small annexations over the past decade. Lakeside Estates had started as a modest subdivision of 50 homes, but had grown to encompass nearly 400 properties. Each expansion had been approved through separate zoning hearings, none significant enough to attract much attention. The most recent boundary adjustment, approved 3 years earlier, had indeed redrawn the lines to include several agricultural properties, including mine. Was there any notification requirement? I asked the clerk. She pointed to a line in the documentation. Just a public notice in the county newspaper and postings at the courthouse. No individual notifications were required since it was not a rezoning, just a boundary adjustment. I left the records office with photocopies of every relevant document, my mind racing. Back at the farm, I spread them across my kitchen table, trying to make sense of how this had happened without my knowledge. The legal language was dense, filled with references to ordinances and statutes I had never encountered. That same afternoon, the black SUVs returned. This time there were 3 vehicles. 6 people from the HOA emerged, armed with clipboards, cameras, and measuring devices. They fanned out across my property without asking permission. "Excuse me," I shouted, jogging toward the nearest pair. "You cannot just walk onto my land." Margaret Whitfield turned to face me, her expression coldly professional. "As representatives of the governing body with jurisdiction over this property, we have every right to conduct inspections." For the next 2 hours they documented everything. They photographed my tractor parked beside the barn, the woodpile behind the workshop, the chicken coop, the weathered paint on the outbuildings. They measured the height of my fences, the distance of structures from property lines, the dimensions of my workshop. A week later, the first violation notices arrived. 23 separate infractions, each with its own fine. Unauthorized agricultural equipment visible from common areas, $250. Livestock housing not meeting aesthetic standards, $500. Unapproved fence height, $300. The list went on, totaling over $8,000 in fines. I contacted 3 different attorneys. The first 2 declined to take the case, citing the complexity and potential costs. The third, a harried man named James Wilkins, agreed to review my documents. After an hour of examination, he looked up with a grim expression. "They found a loophole," he said. "Your property was never rezoned from agricultural use, but the HOA boundaries were legally expanded to include it. It is unusual but not unprecedented." "So they can just take over my farm?" I asked, disbelieving. "Not exactly. They cannot force you to stop agricultural operations, but they can impose their architectural and aesthetic standards, and they can fine you for violations. If the fines go unpaid, they can place liens on your property." The implications were staggering. The HOA could not technically stop me from farming, but they could make it financially impossible to continue. Every aspect of my operation could potentially violate their community standards. I was not alone in this predicament. Over the next few weeks, I spoke with neighboring farmers who shared similar stories. The Edwards family, whose dairy operation had been running for 4 generations, had already put their property up for sale, unable to afford the mounting fines. The Johnsons, who owned 30 acres of orchard to the north, were in negotiations with a developer, seeing no other way out. The pattern became clear when Frank Johnson showed me his research. The president of the Lakeside Estates HOA, Margaret Whitfield, was also a major shareholder in Lakeside Development Corporation. The company that managed the HOA shared an office address with the development firm. This was not random harassment. It was a calculated land grab. Then came the final blow. A thick envelope arrived, containing a formal demand for payment. According to their calculations, I owed not just the recent fines, but back dues for the past 3 years since my property had been incorporated into their boundaries. The total came to $60,000, with the threat that if not paid within 30 days, they would place a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the numbers, feeling the weight of generations of family history pressing down on me. The land that had sustained us for decades, that had been purchased with my grandfather's life savings, tended with my father's sweat, and preserved through my own dedication, was now being systematically stolen through a perversion of regulations meant to protect property values in suburban neighborhoods. Something had to give, and I was terrified it would be me. The neon orange violation notices multiplied like invasive weeds across my property. Each morning I would find new ones stapled to fence posts, pinned to the barn door, attached to equipment left outside. The psychological effect was intentional, a constant visual reminder of their asserted authority over my land. I attempted to engage local media, calling the county newspaper and the regional television station. The newspaper reporter listened politely but ultimately declined to pursue the story. Property disputes between homeowners and HOAs happen all the time, she explained. It is not really newsworthy unless there is something unusual about your case. They are trying to seize a working farm that predates their development by decades, I protested. That is a civil matter, she replied, best handled through proper legal channels. The isolation grew more pronounced as neighboring properties began to change hands. The Millers, whose property adjoined mine to the west, sold to Lakeside Development Corporation after receiving $93,000 in fines. Through my kitchen window, I watched them load the last of their belongings into a moving truck. Sarah Miller, who had been my neighbor for 18 years, stopped by to say goodbye. "We cannot fight them," she said, tears in her eyes. "They have too much money, too many lawyers. We are just farmers." My savings account dwindled with each legal consultation. Attorney Wilkins required a $5,000 retainer just to begin preparing a case, with no guarantee of success. The stress began affecting my sleep, my appetite, my ability to focus on daily tasks. The weight of responsibility to preserve my family legacy crushed down on me with each passing day. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a sweltering afternoon in late June. I had driven into town for supplies and returned to find 3 HOA representatives measuring the exterior dimensions of my barn with laser devices. They had not requested permission to enter my property. They had not notified me of their inspection. They had simply let themselves in, as if they already owned the place. Something snapped inside me. I parked my truck and strode toward them, blood pounding in my ears. "Get off my land," I shouted. "You are trespassing." The youngest of the three, a man I had not seen before, smirked. "We have authorization to inspect all properties within the Lakeside Estate's boundaries. This is a private farm. You have no right to be here without my permission." Margaret Whitfield stepped forward. "Mr. Davidson, you continue to misunderstand the situation. Your property falls under our jurisdiction. Your continued resistance only makes things more difficult for everyone." "More difficult for who?" I demanded. "For your development plans, for your Phase 3 project." The third man, whom I recognized as Victor Coleman, their legal counsel, shot Margaret a warning look, but it was too late. I had seen the flash of surprise in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Nothing," Victor interjected. "We are simply conducting a routine inspection." But the slip had been revealing. That night, I searched online for information about Lakeside Development Corporation and found their investor website. Under Future Projects, I discovered a page detailing Phase 3 of Lakeside Estate's lakefront luxury homes. The architectural renderings showed my fields transformed into cul-de-sacs of enormous houses surrounding an artificial lake where my eastern pasture currently stood. They were not just trying to control my farm. They intended to destroy it completely, to erase every trace of agricultural heritage and replace it with another cookie-cutter subdivision. The next morning, a sheriff's deputy arrived at my door with formal papers. The HOA had filed for an injunction, claiming my persistent and willful violations constituted a nuisance to the community. I was being ordered to vacate the property within 30 days if I could not bring it into compliance and pay all outstanding fines and dues. I stood on my porch after the deputy left, looking out over the fields my family had tended for generations. The corn was nearly knee-high. The fruit trees were heavy with forming apples. The cattle grazed peacefully in the north pasture. All of it, every acre, every structure, every living thing, was scheduled to be bulldozed to make way for luxury homes I could never afford to buy. I had never felt so alone, so powerless, so utterly defeated. Rain lashed against the windows as I sat at my kitchen table, the eviction notice spread before me. The house creaked and groaned against the storm, as if sharing my distress. 3 generations of my family had weathered countless storms in this very room. Would I be the one who lost it all? I had begun boxing up family photographs, sorting through decades of accumulated memories. Each item I packed felt like a surrender, an admission of defeat. The weight of failure pressed down on me, heavier than any physical burden I had ever carried. The county agricultural fair arrived the following weekend. I had already registered months earlier to show 2 of my prize cattle. Going through the motions felt hollow now, but I loaded the animals into the trailer and made the drive to the fairgrounds. Perhaps it would be the last time I participated in this tradition that had been part of my family's annual rhythm for decades. As I stood beside my exhibition stall, an elderly man stopped to admire my Hereford bull. He wore worn jeans and a plaid shirt, but something about his bearing suggested he was not a farmer. He asked knowledgeable questions about bloodlines and feed regimens. "Fine animal," he said, extending his hand. "Martin Grayson." "Thomas Davidson," I replied, shaking his hand. "Davidson Farm," he nodded. "Out on County Road 22, right? Been there forever." "Not for much longer," I said, the bitterness escaping before I could contain it. Martin tilted his head. "Problems." I hesitated, then found myself explaining the entire situation. He listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When I finished, He pulled a business card from his wallet. "I practiced real estate law for 40 years before retiring," he said. "Something does not add up here. Would you mind if I took a look at your paperwork?" That evening, Martin came to the farm. For hours, we pored over every document, every notice, every county record I had collected. Around midnight, he sat back, rubbing his eyes. "There are significant procedural irregularities here," he said. "The boundary expansion was technically legal, but the notification process was suspect. More importantly, your property has explicit agricultural preservation clauses in the original deed." The next day, we drove to the county archives. Martin knew exactly what to look for, guiding the archivist to dusty boxes containing records from the 1950s. The original deed to my property included language specifically preserving its agricultural status in perpetuity, with any change requiring explicit consent from the owner. "This supersedes any boundary adjustment," Martin explained. "They cannot override deed restrictions through HOA expansion." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Martin agreed to help me pro bono, his retirement apparently not dulling his appetite for legal battles. "This kind of predatory behavior makes a mockery of property rights," he said. "I have been watching these developers operate for years." We formulated a strategy. While Martin built the legal case, I would focus on community organizing and investigation. I contacted other farmers facing similar pressure, arranging a meeting at my kitchen table. 7 families attended, each bringing their own documentation of harassment from lakeside estates. The local historical society proved surprisingly helpful. Their archives contained photographs and records documenting the agricultural heritage of the area dating back to the 1800s. The society's president, Eleanor McMahon, was passionate about preserving rural history. "What they are doing threatens the character of this entire region," she declared, providing me with copies of historical designations that might strengthen our case. I spent evenings researching the HOA board members, building profiles of each one. The connections to Lakeside Development Corporation ran deep. Margaret Whitfield owned 15% of the development company. The HOA treasurer, Brian Hoffman, had a brother who owned the construction company that built all Lakeside Estates homes. The secretary had previously worked as a sales agent for the development. Most damning of all, the HOA had been systematically diverting funds from homeowner dues to finance land acquisition. This violated both their own bylaws and state regulations governing homeowners associations. Martin identified multiple procedural violations in how the HOA had expanded its jurisdiction. They failed to follow proper notification protocols, he explained, and they never disclosed the conflicts of interest between the HOA board and the development company. Our case was building, piece by piece. The isolation I had felt gave way to a sense of solidarity as other farmers joined our cause. The legal strategy took shape: challenge the boundary expansion on procedural grounds, assert the supremacy of the agricultural preservation clauses in the original deeds, and file complaints regarding the conflicts of interest and financial improprieties. We gathered around my dining room table, maps and documents covering every inch of the surface. Martin pointed to specific paragraphs in the county code that had been violated. The faces around the table showed the first signs of hope many had felt in months. "They have money and connections," Martin acknowledged, "but we have the law on our side, and just as importantly, we have the moral high ground." For the first time since the nightmare began, I slept through the night. When I walked my fields the next morning, I did not see land that was about to be lost. I saw ground worth fighting for, heritage worth preserving, a future still possible. The battle was just beginning, but at least now we had weapons to fight it. I called each farmer who had joined our coalition. "Meet at my place Saturday morning," I told them. "Bring anyone else who might be affected. We are going to fight back." The power was shifting. We were no longer isolated individuals facing an overwhelming force. We were becoming a movement, gathering strength with each new ally, each new discovery, each new strategy. The HOA had awakened a community that had been silent too long, and now they would face the consequences of their overreach. The county commission meeting room was packed to capacity. Farmers in work clothes and boots filled the public seating area, a stark contrast to the business attire of the commissioners and development representatives. I approached the podium when my name was called, carrying a folder containing our formal complaint. "My name is Thomas Davidson," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "My family has farmed our land for 3 generations. Today I am here to expose unlawful actions taken by Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association and Lakeside Development Corporation." For the next 10 minutes, I methodically presented our evidence of procedural violations in the boundary expansion, conflicts of interest among HOA board members, and the agricultural preservation clauses in our original deeds. Martin had coached me carefully on what to emphasize and what supporting documents to provide. The commissioner's expressions shifted as I spoke. What had begun as polite indifference transformed into genuine concern. When I revealed that the HOA had been systematically targeting family farms through boundary manipulations, Commissioner Rodriguez leaned forward, asking pointed questions about notification procedures. "We were never informed," I stated firmly. "The first we knew of it was when they began issuing violation notices." Local news cameras captured the entire presentation. The story of rural landowners fighting corporate developers struck a chord that transcended the usual political divisions. That evening, 2 local television stations ran segments on the dispute. Our coalition launched a coordinated social media campaign, sharing personal stories of harassment and intimidation. We created the Save Our Farms Facebook page, which gained over 1,000 followers in its first week. Photographs of violation notices stapled to century-old barns, side-by-side comparisons of architectural renderings versus existing farmland, and copies of threatening letters from the HOA spread rapidly across community forums. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Residents from both rural areas and the suburbs themselves expressed outrage at the tactics being employed. Many Lakeside Estates homeowners commented that they had no idea their HOA dues were being used to target neighboring farms. The next scheduled HOA board meeting became our target. 25 members of our coalition attended, filling the meeting room at the Lakeside Estates Community Center. When the public comment period began, I approached the microphone with copies of our evidence for each board member. "Madam President," I addressed Margaret Whitfield, "would you care to explain why you failed to disclose your 15% ownership stake in Lakeside Development Corporation while voting on matters directly benefiting that company?" The room fell silent. Margaret's composed expression faltered momentarily before she regained control. "That accusation is completely unfounded," she replied coldly. I placed the corporate ownership records on the table. "These public documents indicate otherwise." For the next 30 minutes, our coalition members took turns presenting evidence of board members' conflicts of interest, financial irregularities, and violation of HOA bylaws. As the meeting descended into chaos, Margaret abruptly adjourned the session, refusing to address the allegations. The retaliation was swift and severe. The next morning, I awoke to find concrete barriers blocking the access road to my eastern fields. A private security vehicle was parked nearby, its occupant watching my house through binoculars. Similar barriers appeared at other coalition members' properties. When I attempted to move my tractor to the eastern fields by cutting across a different section of my property, 2 security guards intercepted me, claiming I was violating HOA regulations by operating farm equipment during restricted hours. "This is my land," I shouted. "You have no authority to prevent me from farming it." "We have been instructed to enforce all HOA regulations," the larger guard responded, physically positioning himself in front of my tractor. Unknown to them, my neighbor Bill Edwards had deployed his drone to record the entire confrontation from above. The footage, showing private security physically blocking a farmer from accessing his own fields, went viral locally, further turning public opinion against the HOA. The breakthrough came 3 days later. Martin had been methodically reviewing the documentation of the boundary expansion process. He discovered that 3 signatures on the critical boundary adjustment application appeared to be forgeries. The names belonged to property owners who had died before the documents were supposedly signed. We immediately filed for an emergency hearing with Judge Eleanor Simmons, known for her strong stance on property rights. The evidence of forgery, combined with the documented harassment, prompted her to issue a temporary restraining order. Her voice trembled with barely contained anger as she read her ruling. The court orders that all representatives and agents of Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association are prohibited from entering, inspecting, or in any way interfering with the agricultural operations of the listed properties pending full hearing of this matter. She fixed Margaret Whitfield with a stern gaze, and the court will be referring the matter of potentially forged documents to the district attorney's office for investigation. As we left the courthouse, Martin placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is just the beginning," he cautioned. "They will fight back with everything they have." "So will we," I replied, feeling the first real sense of victory since this ordeal began. That evening, I removed the orange violation notices from my fence posts and barn door, one by one. Each removal felt like reclaiming a piece of my property, my heritage, my right to exist as my family had for generations. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I believed we might actually win. The story exploded across local media. "Family Farm Fights Corporate Land Grab," read the headline in the county newspaper, which now devoted its front page to the controversy they had initially dismissed. Television news crews arrived at my farm, capturing aerial footage that dramatically contrasted my working agricultural operation with the encroaching suburban development. "We just want to preserve our way of life," I told the cameras, standing in front of the barn my father had built. "These farms have been feeding this community for generations. We are not opposed to progress, but this is not progress. It is erasure." The news segments featured interviews with multiple farmers, each sharing similar stories of harassment and intimidation. The elderly Williams couple, both in their 80s, broke down on camera describing how they had been fined for keeping their tractor visible from the road. "We have had that John Deere for 40 years, Mrs. Williams sobbed. "Now they tell us it lowers property values." The tide of public opinion shifted dramatically when a plain manila envelope arrived at my home, containing no return address. Inside were printed copies of email communications between HOA board members and Lakeside Development executives. The emails discussed acquisition strategies for resistant properties, and methods for circumventing agricultural protection statutes. Most damning was an email from Margaret Whitfield to the development company's CEO. Once the expanded HOA boundaries are established, we can make continued agricultural operations financially untenable through strategic enforcement of aesthetic regulations. I immediately shared the documents with our attorney and the local media. Within hours, the emails were being read aloud on local news broadcasts. The anonymous whistleblower from within the HOA management company had provided the smoking gun we needed. The county commission called an emergency hearing on all pending development permits for lakeside estates. The commission chambers overflowed with citizens demanding action. Commissioner Rodriguez opened the session with a stern statement. This commission has a responsibility to ensure that development occurs legally, ethically, and in accordance with our community values. The evidence presented suggests serious breaches of that trust. The HOA and development representative sat stone-faced as citizen after citizen approached the microphone to speak against their tactics. The commissioners voted unanimously to suspend all pending permits for lakeside estates expansions until a full investigation could be completed. As public pressure mounted, the HOA attempted a different approach. A representative appeared at my door offering a settlement of $100,000 if I would quietly resolve this matter and withdraw all complaints. I declined. 3 days later, the offer increased to $250,000. Again, I refused. When they returned with an offer of $500,000, I did not even invite them inside. "This is not about money," I told them from my porch. "This is about right and wrong. This is about preserving something valuable for future generations." Our attorney filed a motion for comprehensive financial discovery, forcing the HOA to open its books to scrutiny. The results were devastating to their case. Financial records revealed systematic misappropriation of HOA funds to finance land acquisition and legal harassment. Homeowner dues designated for community improvements had instead been diverted to create a war chest for expanding HOA territory. The day before the permanent injunction hearing, hundreds of protesters gathered in the courthouse square. Surprisingly, many were lakeside estates residents themselves, outraged to discover how their dues had been misused. They carried signs reading "Farms, not lawns" and "Protect property rights." One lakeside resident, Janet Chen, spoke passionately to the crowd. "We moved here because we valued the rural character of this area. We wanted to live near farms, not destroy them. The HOA does not speak for us." The momentum had shifted completely. What had begun as a David versus Goliath struggle had transformed into a community united against corrupt development practices. People from all walks of life recognized that unchecked HOA power threatened everyone's property rights, regardless of whether they lived in suburban homes or on family farms. As I stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by supporters from both rural and suburban communities, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. My isolation had been replaced by solidarity. My despair had given way to determination. The forces that had sought to divide us had instead united us in defense of something fundamental: the right to maintain our way of life in the face of powerful interests that would erase it for profit. Martin approached me through the crowd, a rare smile on his face. "They are offering to settle again," he said. "This time they want to withdraw all claims to agricultural properties in exchange for dropping our complaints." "Not good enough," I replied. "We need to make sure they can never do this to anyone else." He nodded, understanding perfectly. "Then we continue to court tomorrow." As the crowd dispersed, I looked across the street to where Margaret Whitfield stood watching, her expression unreadable. For the first time since this ordeal began, she was the one who looked uncertain, outmaneuvered, and alone. The courtroom was silent as Judge Simmons entered. The hearing for a permanent injunction had drawn such public interest that the court had been forced to issue attendance tickets. Every seat was filled, with farmers and suburban residents sitting side by side. Judge Simmons had reviewed thousands of pages of evidence over the preceding weeks. Her expression was grave as she called the court to order. This case presents fundamental questions about property rights, due process, and the limits of private governance, she began. For the next hour, attorneys for both sides presented their final arguments. The HOA's lawyers attempted to frame the issue as a simple matter of covenant enforcement. Our attorney, with Martin Grayson assisting, methodically dismantled that argument by presenting evidence of forged documents, conflicts of interest, and procedural violations. When all arguments had concluded, Judge Simmons delivered her ruling without hesitation. The evidence before this court demonstrates a calculated conspiracy to misappropriate established agricultural properties through fraudulent means, she declared, her voice resonating with rare indignation. The court hereby grants the plaintiff's motion for permanent injunction against any Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association claims to the agricultural properties listed in this action. She continued, addressing the financial misconduct. The evidence further reveals approximately $2 million in HOA funds diverted to finance the development company's land acquisition strategy, in direct violation of the HOA's own charter and state regulations governing such organizations. Margaret Whitfield and the other board members sat stiffly as the judge announced they would be personally liable for their actions. The court finds that board members acted with knowledge and intent in this matter, removing the shield of organizational liability. The judge further ordered that all fines and fee assessments against agricultural properties be nullified, and that the HOA pay all legal costs incurred by the plaintiff farmers. She concluded by announcing she was referring the case to the state attorney general for potential criminal prosecution regarding the forged documents. As the implications of the ruling spread through the courtroom, relief and joy swept through our coalition. Farmers who had lived under the shadow of financial ruin for months embraced one another. Even some Lakeside Estates residents in attendance applauded the decision. The county commissioners, emboldened by public support and the court ruling, unanimously passed emergency protections for agricultural zones. The new ordinance created a buffer zone around established farms and required supermajority approval for any rezoning of agricultural land. When the judgment for damages was announced a month later, it exceeded our expectations. The HOA and development company were ordered to pay $750,000 in compensation for harassment and attempted property theft, plus all legal fees. After consultation with the other affected farmers, I decided to use the bulk of these funds to establish the Heritage Farmland Trust, a legal entity that would permanently protect not just my property, but neighboring farms from future development schemes. The HOA president and development company CEO faced multiple state investigations for fraud and corruption. The local newspaper, which had initially dismissed our plight, now ran a comprehensive investigative series on development practices in the region. 6 months after the ruling, I stood on the ridge overlooking my eastern fields. The wheat was nearly ready for harvest, the stalks bending gently in the evening breeze. In the distance, I could see the rooftops of Lakeside Estates, no longer a threat but simply neighbors. Many of those homeowners had become allies in our fight for balanced development practices. The legal battle had transformed not just my situation, but the entire community's approach to development. New housing was still being built, but with greater respect for existing agricultural operations and rural character. The Heritage Farmland Trust now protected over 2,000 acres of productive farmland from inappropriate development. As the sun set over fields that had been in my family for 3 generations, and would now remain farmland for generations to come, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had evolved into something more significant. We had not just preserved our individual farms. We had reestablished the principle that progress does not require erasing the past, that communities can grow without destroying their foundations, that the rights of the powerful must never override the rights of all. From my vantage point, I could see my grandfather's old oak tree silhouetted against the dimming sky. No violation notices marred its ancient trunk now. It stood as it always had, rooted in soil that would remain agricultural land in perpetuity, a living testament to the power of standing firm against seemingly impossible odds.